Designers and Builders, where design meets construction. We explore groundbreaking trends and talk to the pros reshaping our spaces. For your dream home, workspace, or just great design inspiration, subscribe to Designers and Builders.
Hello, and welcome to today's brand new episode of Designers and Builders. I'm your host, Alyssa Olson, and today we're welcoming Adam Greenspan. He's a partner and design director at PWP Landscape Architecture based out of Berkeley, California. How are you today, Adam?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for being our guest. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we were just chatting about your backdrop. I love the long section perspective. It's very landscape forward.
That's what we are here, landscape forward, definitely, in all different ways. But big drawings, that's kind of a small one in the scale of our walls and our office.
Incredible. We'll definitely need to get there and check it out sometime.
You're invited anytime.
All right, appreciate that. So let's dive right in. Tell us your story of how you found your way to landscape architecture and the design world.
My background, I guess, I've always been interested in what I think now of as landscape architecture in all the parts and all the combinations and sort of focuses that can go into it as a discipline overall. But really, I think I grew up in the Hollywood Hills, so I was in a sort of strange landscape or a strange urban landscape in that it was very wild behind my house, and I hiked in the hills behind my house among native California hills and plants and animals and streams. But I went to school in the city, and I was in the middle of the city because that's where the Hollywood Hills are. And so I think I always took art classes, always was interested in animals, plants, people, art. And in various ways, that's, how I got to where I am. I went to college in Connecticut on the East Coast at Wesleyan, and I majored in studio art, which was installation art at that time for me, and then also sociology. So it was a double major. And while I was there, I also worked at the greenhouse as my campus job, work study program. And so when I graduated, I moved to San Francisco and really did art. I wanted to, make things. And so I did that, but I also had to make money. So I got a job at a nursery, and I became a certified California nursery person. And I also did buying for this retail nursery from wholesale nurseries, so that I was sort of started on the indoor plants, and then I expanded to outdoor container stock material. So I expanded my knowledge in plants over that time, but also in dealing with people. And so it ended up being that all through then going to the summer program at the GSD. And Kate Orff was my instructor back in 1997 or something like that.
Oh, nice.
And then it turned to, I discovered my career at Career Discovery, and I interned at Hargraves Associates back in San Francisco, and then continued on to graduate school at Penn. So that was the way it all started. Seems very linear, but it was not really exactly my focus, or what I knew I would be going into. But it can be told in a way because it sort of takes in so many things, landscape architecture does.
Yeah, it really does. And it sounds like your background in those different parts and pieces really formed that path for you and helped you find your way to that.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. I mean, and I think it was a relief to me to find that there was some kind of both discipline and profession, and especially a profession that I could think about and engage with the ideas and the kinds of, connections that I was really interested in thinking about. And I think that was the thing about both sociology and art, is that they're both ways of looking at the world, or ways to think about or work through things going on in the world, a frame, in which to think about life and existence. And I think landscape architecture definitely connects into both of those things all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was your connection between being in the Bay with plants and the career discovery? Like, how did you connect the dots on that?
Well, I mean, actually, I went to a private art teacher from the time I was in kindergarten through high school, one day a week, Friday afternoons. Her name was Dorothy Cannon, and she did all kinds of art, and I did all kinds of art through that time, which included, and I guess I wouldn't say these are art, but making a pond in her backyard as I got into high school. Towards the end of high school, I made an aviary for songbirds in her backyard. And she suggested then, you should think about landscape architecture. She mentioned it. I sort of was not focused on that and didn't really think about it again. But I took art and architecture classes in undergraduate. And then when I did the rest of these things in San Francisco, the art shows and the nursery and garden design work, I ended up hearing about career discovery program from a friend of mine who did the architecture program. So I went in landscape.
Very cool. Yeah, it's always an interesting journey as to how people find their way into the landscape architecture field.
Mm-hmm.
Then all these different backgrounds that they can pull in and really, I mean, as shown behind you in your backdrop, like these things really come through in the way in which you work in your design process.
Yeah, I think the process of experience, collaboration, design, I think has always been the thing that has engaged me. So as an artist or somebody focused on doing art, it was hard to be singular and individual only. There was always collaboration in the work that I did. And that's something that I think really comes to the fore in the kinds of work that we do here at PWP and that I've wanted to do over the years.
Yeah. And so then as an artist, like, is that something, do you try to integrate artful moments into your work versus having, your installations as a separate thing? Like, are those things that you've been able to merge throughout your career?
I think, because the kind of work that I was focused on was experience and installation art that also bridged across sort of space and experience of space and time and living systems. I think all of those things go into landscape architecture, and I don't think of art, or at least I didn't back then, as an object to be viewed. And not in, I wasn't into making classical sculptures, for example, though I did that sometimes. And I think that's a way to think about the work conceptually that we do, or that landscape architecture might try to engage, and achieve, is that what is the meaning? What are the goals? What is the concept of the bigger picture of the work that you're doing? And then how does the physical design work and how does the physical design form and elements in the real world connect into those ideas and also make ideas lived, able to be lived by people, by plants, by animals? And I think that sounds very abstract, but I think getting to things like climate change, things like biodiversity, experience, education, wonder, all of those aspects are topics and issues that we are dealing with and trying to engage in the work that we do. And I think trying to make places that are experienced in really actualized and felt ways by the people that visit or see or come to or move through the projects that we create, I think is something that has a connection to the way that people experience art, or the way that art may touch people. I think there's a hope that just through experience and through physical contact, with places, that some change or some deeper or different understanding might happen inside of people that visit and use the projects that we make. Spatial experience, physical, experience between people, but I think that the landscape architecture is much more tied into systems and realities of the world. And I think as a firm and as a designer here and the work that we do as a team here, we're very invested in doing design work that gets built, that becomes part of places, and also becomes, not only part of places, but thought of as home by the communities in those places, thought of, as memorable places that are part of both the natural systems, the communities, and the geographic locations, where they're found.
Yeah, so many thoughts rushing through my head. Like, I feel like you've really put a pin in all these different complex layers. Like landscape architecture, it's not just this beautiful place you experience, but it's this mirror web of all these things you mentioned: the biodiversity, the place, the people, the generational aspect, time, the ecologies you're influencing, all these different things that are both abstract and also very technical, and also client driven, relevant to the modern times, to the future, all these different really complex things. And so I feel like, yeah, how do you grapple with that? And when it comes to, I feel like a dichotomy that's been coming up a lot lately is like, creating these really beautiful, magical places, but then also having them be client driven. So there's also the pressures of kind of time, money, regulatory efforts. How do you approach that in your process?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's really a difficult reality, of working and being focused on built work, because built work needs to have, like you're saying, whether it's a client or a funder or, a steady sequence and process that leads to the realization, of the work at the scales that we work in. It's not often working with an individual contractor or an individual client. It's usually more complex kind of sites and associations than that. And I think that trying to maintain, whether it's a concept or a structure or a depth to, what ends up getting built, is something that you need to keep your eye on the goals, and you need to know how to measure your team's focus and input, so that you don't basically spend all of your money all the time before you get the project done, because we don't get infinite budgets at all. We don't work clients that say whatever you want goes, even though, at times the legacy and the history of Peter Walker and the firm, within the bigger picture of landscape architecture and design firms. I guess you asked what might people not think or not know about me or about the firm. I think sometimes people think that legacy might mean that there are projects that are sort of offered and they just move forward as they need to, without very hard budgets or timelines, but actually that's not the case. It hasn't been the case for the whole time that I've been here. It's been sort of working to win and make the case that you can do projects, or you have a good idea related to projects, and also constantly trying to expand, our focus as a firm, the collaboration and the different voices and ideas in the firm. But still, while we're trying to expand the number of voices and hear all the voices in the firm, what we also really try to do is to create work and projects at the end that have the potential to really touch people, really offer something to society and communities, and also living systems, and that's something we've been working to expand, but it's not easy. It's trying to keep your finger on a lot of touch points, through the life of a project. And with the projects that we work on, that life can be, maybe the fastest is 3 years, but some and many take 7 years, 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah. Right. And that's just to be built and realized, right? And then there's the
Yeah.
life of the project beyond that. There might be maintenance things or, checking, and also observing. I'm sure, and I think that's the benefit of someone like Pete Walker and his, partners, your entire firm who've been around for decades at this point, is you have kind of that built-in knowledge of how things work over time. And it seems like you could integrate those lessons learned into future projects while also integrating realities of modern times, right? So building on those time metrics.
And I think that's really insightful, what you're saying, because that's what I say, that's what we say, and that's what we do. I don't always know that others see that as a potential for a firm that is, I think, an ongoing and transitioned firm. So at the moment, Pete has retired from the firm.
Mm.
doing well, and he's 90. He'll be 94 in a week or so.
Wow.
And he comes in. He has his own projects. He's continuing on, and also is available and engaged for review or discussion. But I think one thing that he was always committed to was the reality of the built and living project. And over time, as he and the other partners here saw work that they had done 20, 30, and in his case 50, 60 years ago, change through that time, the priorities and the important aspects of places and of uh, landscape shifted some. So I think people associate Peter Walker with hardscape maybe, or pattern, or furniture, as about the time that I came to this office and when I started leading the internship program, and we would do field trips in the Bay Area to different project sites or different natural landscapes. What he was talking about, and what I was talking about on one of the field trips we went on, was that as he had gone back to projects, he started really appreciating the trees and the living parts of the designs in a much bigger way than he had in the early days of his career. Because when they would be successful and they would grow and live, they would be the strongest element in any project, decades later. Whereas what he had thought was something that would stay forever, the hardscape, was something that if it was not maintained, it really would not be, holding the space and the place there. And so I think as he was feeling those things, maybe from spatial and physical structural aspects of the designs, I also had been coming from a plant-focused background and was really trying to work in a much expanded way of thinking about the plants, the planted systems, the trees that we would use, and a focus on living systems as a much bigger part of the work, in every project, across all projects here. And I think that's something that we've been evolving and growing, over all of these years, but something that was sort of an overlap between looking forward and looking back related to professional practice over many decades. That sort of was an interesting evolution and transition process and evolution of the focus of the types of work that we do.
Yeah, which is just incredible. The realm, and I'm sure it's possibly impossible to have caught up on all of Pete's work. I don't know how internal shares go in the office, but having all those archived projects, it seems like you keep things up on the walls, which is great. But having that knowledge transferred seems kind of like a blessing and a curse. I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, and I think that's I think one question that was asked, was what was a decision that changed the trajectory of my career? And I think you said blessing and a curse. I think the opportunity for jumping in and continuing sort of legacy firm in a certain way. There's opportunity because the potential for the scale of projects that we are able to respond to and that also have gotten over the years is probably and is something that I wouldn't have been involved with at the level that I was as early as I was. And then also the opportunities that come with that related to evolution and expansion, building off of that. At the same time, there's also, like you're saying, some preconceived notions or associations that might be related to history or related to ideas that were from another time, when the ideas that are current and contemporary in the office and in what we're doing are not rooted in some of those historical thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and having such a vast body of work, that makes sense, right? You are continuing to evolve, you and your landscapes over time.
Exactly.
Change.
And I
Yeah.
think you brought up the question of maintenance and management. I think that's something that really has also been an evolution in the work that we've been doing, that there's different ways to think about landscapes maturing and changing, and also different ways to think about goals and design intent. And it's not all at all about aesthetics only, or the way that places look, or the way that they feel because of their hard construction. It's also about the ways that people and communities can use these places, and not only use them the day that they're built and for what they're intended when they're built, but the idea that there might be changing ways of use by communities over time, and being able to think about that time as, as over decades, not just over weeks, months, a few years, but that really there is the idea of decades, not only because of Pete Walker's age, and time and sort of history related to the work of this office, but because of the life of trees, and the life of the earth, as someone that's been working with plants and with trees. In the beginning, it seemed like it'll take 7 years for that tree to establish and really begin to grow, or 3 years. And that seemed like so long.
Mhm.
Or it might be 10 years before the competition we won gets built and is open. That seemed like a long time. After you've lived a number of decades and you've watched trees grow from, whips to really, architectural elements in the landscape of their own, you realize how short a time the design period is, the installation period, and how long the potential for life, and existence is. And that what we're doing, hopefully, is able to transition through time, both the living systems and resilient trees and, multi-layered vegetation, fungi, animals, but also social and human use and the different kinds of interests and engagements that people have through time. The fact that places like Versailles might get used for the Olympics in 2024, even though that wasn't anything that it was designed for in any way, is, I think, an interesting way that landscapes and gardens that people really appreciate and cherish might then be recast in entirely different ways, decades down the line.
Yeah. And I find it interesting as a designer because, you have the client or the set program, right? So you're kind of designing to thing A and what you think it's going to be, but then it inevitably becomes this other thing. And I'm curious for PWP projects, like, do you as a team go to these sites to revisit them and observe these different changes? And then does that in turn influence your upcoming designs?
Definitely. I mean, I think as a team we do that with projects that, like, meaning as a wide team, the whole
Mhm.
office, we try to visit one recent or historical project at least every summer, sort of as a whole group. And we sort of overlap that with some of our intern program field trips, but then we engage the whole office. And so this is a moment where we try to all come together and then, in a loose way, learn from the past, but also experience new things together. But I would be going to the old projects, everywhere in Texas between point A and point B, and sort of making my own judgments and thoughts, but also bringing photos and questions back to the office and talking to people that had worked on these things or that had visited them. And so I think that's something that we really try to have happen. But that's not only with our projects, that's with projects around the world and from different offices and from different people. We really learn from both projects, but also natural systems, natural places, and undesigned places in the world that are really where life is happening.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought that up because when I was working for Methuen in San Francisco, we had moved our office and we were right under the Transbay Transit Center, the Salesforce Park.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, a very popular lunch spot or maybe happy hour. And it's incredible. And I also just want to call out, you working with plants in the Bay Area. I don't know if you don't live there, a lot of people aren't aware it's a Mediterranean climate. So the range of biodiversity of plants is huge. And even after decades of learning about plants, you might not even be fully knowledgeable, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that park is a really good example because you have and I'd love for you to speak to this, but all these different zones of planting, incredible signage. It's really beautiful. And something, we do a lot of site walks there to observe materials, observe planting. When the pandemic happened and there were no people there, the plants all took off. And so
Yeah.
even that park in the matter of a couple of years, completely transformed. And so did the programming of the space.
Yeah, no, so yeah, you've experienced some of my life, of our lives, so happy to hear that you were near there and used it and noticed some of these things. I think two things happened with number one, for anyone who's listening or watching, Salesforce Park is a public park. It's not a Salesforce park. Salesforce got the naming rights to this, and so we were happy for their sponsorship. But I think the thing that can be unfortunate is that it can come off as though it was designed for a company, which it was not. It was designed for an intergovernmental agency and for the people and city of San Francisco and visitors to San Francisco. So bringing what's really almost a mini botanical gardens or a garden and park that is meant to offer experience that is separate from the car focused activity on the street, up at a higher level and in a warmer space and a connected green space in the middle of a very hard constructed part of the city. I think it's working well, it sounds, as a place to really introduce people to the array of plants that can grow, in our climate here, this Mediterranean climate, but also the native plants, from the San Francisco Bay Area, but also and California. And I think not everyone goes to botanical gardens, not everyone goes to national parks, not everyone can get to places where they have firsthand experience and tactile experience with plants and the animals that use those plants. And I think that opportunity at originally the Transbay Transit Center and now Salesforce Transit Center was something that we saw during the competition and that really has been gratifying to have been a part of. And this is me, but it was a whole big team in the office over many years and really key people working on different aspects of the design and of the project, but also across many different firms because it's a giant infrastructural construction. But I think all of that said, the wonder of coming 70 feet above the ground and then being in a green park with butterflies and birds and hummingbird nests and specific plants where you can see interactions happening between people, plants, animals, I think is something that is so unusual for a transit center, for a bus station, for a railroad or a high-speed rail station. And I think it really does make these experiences available in a very unique way to people of all walks of life. And when you walk around the park behind people, which is there's a loop path that is about a half mile long, you hear people talking about those things happening on either side of them. They're pointing at the plants, they're talking about individual species or flowers or leaves or thorns. And it's something that I really hope has the potential to connect with people that might go somewhere different and surprising in their own lives, whether it's immediately after visiting it or somewhere in the future of their lives, that there will be the possibility for an effect on people because of what we tried to bring together there.
Absolutely. And something in working with people from all over the world, especially in grad school, fellow international design students, is when you're exposed to plants in one location and versus another location, they actually look different.
Mm-hmm.
And they are different. And I think that's also interesting because you have such a wide array in the plant palette that also I feel keys in for people like, oh, well, in my home place in this country, this is how this is, but here is how it is here. And that's also the power and magic of landscape, is kind of connecting, because ecology is a global thing, even though it's highly localized.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we were hoping to get expressed in some way. And whether it's through the experience of the plants and the animals or that come to them, or reading or hearing some of the interpretational signage and elements, it wasn't only about the plants, it's about the climate of San Francisco, about the fog of San Francisco. And I think that connection to other places, like the Chilean garden at Salesforce Park, being particularly suited to the rooftop of this space in downtown San Francisco because of a similarity between the climates of the two places, is also something that project was hoping to draw out, not only because you read it, but because people that know one place might see a connection and a difference between this place here and that place there because of what's growing, because of what is happening around what's growing, and the people who are seeing and thinking and commenting about all that.
Yeah, it's also, it just occurred to me, in a place like San Francisco that's such a global city, it's also a nice invitation for different, representing different types of people from cultures all over the world. It's like little pieces of their home in the place that's now home to them or that they're visiting. And I think something else to call out is, and something that you had mentioned before, is just this thought or this notion that people think that landscapes are just natural. Even though, if you look at the section of the Transbay terminal, it's incredibly technical. There's all these structural considerations. There's all these modes of transit zooming under you. Like, how do you kind of deal with that when that comes up? Like that idea of nature versus constructed nature.
I think that's something that, I mean, on the Salesforce Park, it's on the roof 70 feet above the ground. So even when you're in it, if you feel like you're in a park, you're 70 feet above the ground and you've come up through this building. I think on a project that something like Glenstone Museum in Maryland, which is another project that that I led for quite a while. It began as one, which was a residence, but then a foundation was made and it was expanded quite a lot bigger than the original project, and is open to the public. And it's an art museum and about a 200, 300 acre sculpture and ecological park. And I think it's mostly on the ground. There's just a little bit that's on structure. And we've worked over almost 300 acres to varying degrees. Some of those acres have been completely regraded and graded from what was former architectural or housing sites where houses were demolished, and this has now been turned into a forest where those were. Other spaces are native perennial and grass meadow on rolling hills that had been mown pasture for farmland. And so there's been a lot of transition and change and design that's gone into what has been intended to be a very naturalistic design that allows water to flow naturally across the land and go into the ground and be filtered through the planting that was initiated but then has been continued through a process of management over time rather than gardening exactly, because it's a very big scale. And so I think people, when they go to this museum, often they're art lovers that come, or find their way to this place. But the design that we developed with Thomas Pfeiffer's office and Tom as the big picture way that the phase 2 project would work was that you were intended to leave your car in a parking grove, which is the restored forest. You walk across a bridge through a wooded edge and you come out into this giant meadow, and you walk for about 5 minutes before you get to the museum. So people that are coming for art or because they're interested in seeing art then walk through habitat and designed, landscape for 5 minutes before they get there. And then they also have moments where the museum itself is focused on natural systems and views out to the landscape as part of what the museum is exhibiting. And so I guess what I'm getting with all of this is many people walk through that meadow and for those 5 minutes, and they may think that this is all nature, natural, and undesigned. And that is perhaps totally fine, but it's definitely not the case. It's fine that they think that, or fine that they're enjoying it, without giving idea to an author. That's okay. But it's not, things like this don't happen by themselves in suburban locations in this day and age. I think landscape architects and landscape architecture is about working to consider and propose ways of interacting and ways of use, settlement, experience, and identity that really considers living systems and the living world and tries to enable that living world in a very increasingly difficult place for life to continue to exist in. And so I think it's really important that people eventually And I think at Glenstone, they do learn this as they're there because of some of the specifics in the design and also the interpretation and communication that happens with it as an institution and from the people there. But I think people need to begin to be more understanding that both built architecture and what seems like unbuilt landscape is all part of design and a language of design and consideration that landscape architects, I think, are leading, at various scales.
Absolutely. And it's also, there's kind of the feeling of the landscape, but then also the metrics like you were talking about, like stormwater management is highly tracked in the Bay Area, for example. And I'm curious at the ecological level, and you mentioned like the hummingbird nesting and these different layers, like, is that something internally that PWP tracks, or is it more observational based?
Well, I was talking about observation. What we do for Salesforce Park, we, PWP, still is involved in maintenance and management reviews. And so we do go whenever we all and each want to, but officially we go 4 times a year to review the state and the management and issues that might be coming up at the park with their ownership and landscape management team. And
Okay.
so in considering pruning of some of the trees, we do, and we're aware that there were 5 hummingbird nests, and we didn't prune the trees at times where those hummingbirds would be disturbed and their nests. But what we did do with Salesforce Park is that it is a case study that was taken on by the Landscape Architecture Foundation's case study investigation program, where we partnered with Haven Kears at UC Davis and somebody on her team to do assessments that were official, both surveying some aspects at the park and also some interviews and questionnaires that were given to people, visitors and things like that, which all then has been put together and published as some of the metrics that were trackable and traceable related to the park. And that's on LAF's website under case study investigations for Salesforce Park.
Cool. Yeah, that's very. I was curious, like how that came about, because I don't feel like that's ever a mandated or agreed to maintenance strategy. Is these like rigorous every 3 months we're going to visit the site and track these things. So that's really fascinating, especially that LAF took it on. Like you're collaborating at these different scales and within the profession. So that's super cool to learn about for the park.
Well, and I think that's also something to shout out to everyone in landscape architecture, that Landscape Architecture Foundation has a website that then has many case studies on it, which have been taken on and done between sort of the designers and the professional designers that designed these projects, pairing with an academic institution to do an assessment and then come up with sort of the assessed metrics for the sustainability sort of goals and achievements of each of those projects. And so it's a great place to look as precedents for things that maybe you can, again, like you were asking about the PWP projects through time, you can look at these precedent projects and either use some of them as models or find and figure ways that you might do better than some of those things that are up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good resource. And it's also nice that it's through LAF because, as a firm and under a project, you wouldn't necessarily have capacity or fee for that.
Exactly.
So it's a really great resource for everybody.
Well, and I think that's something that I've found. I've been on the board and the president of the board with LAF for some years, president only 1 year. But then, and I'm really excited about the work and the way that LAF brings both landscape architecture to the forefront, but also connects across disciplines and across sort of sectors. It's not only an academic sort of focus or a practitioner focus. There's also the general public and other production side of landscape architecture and architecture that are involved in LAF. And I think landscape architects, we're always trying to better ourselves and do better for the world, for our projects, in each new project or in the different firms that are all working and trying to do both better for yourself, but really better for the world, I think. And it's hard when it is all based on fees and being funded. There's only so far that you can take sort of the financial support that you get, and you're not able necessarily to do tracking and testing either before or always many years after projects are built. And so it's really great that LAF has made that program and is able to support and advocate for these kinds of partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. The billable hours in our profession are very real. And
Yeah.
so another question related to that, and you had mentioned this previously, but AI, what's your take on that? Is it muddying the waters? Is it productive? How's that going?
Did I mention AI?
It was something in your intake form.
Oh,
Maybe it wasn't
okay.
you.
Well, maybe I did. Muddying it's definitely a confusing time related, I think, to AI. I think there are great, for a quick assessment or pulling together of known information, AI assistance can be helpful. I think in continuing this faster pace of life and the world and people's mindset of how quickly they can get anything, and whether that's a client or a politician or a designer, or a student, I feel that it's really negative to feel like you should be able to understand the depth of the world in a second, or to get a design proposal or an idea generated within seconds or minutes. I think is you know I think is a negative fact, that's related to this progress in AI. And I think that it's kind of like sugar. It builds on itself. When you eat sugar, at least when I eat sugar, I want more sugar. And, you need to put an end to this sometimes, but it can rev on itself and you can feed that, in a way that's unhealthy. And I think that that's what AI and many of the shortcuts or many of the aspects that are progress have the potential to do, is make people look less deeply, not see things clearly, not research things or take time to understand things, and not give other systems, whether it's living systems or mechanical systems, the time that it takes those kinds of physical systems to work, or to develop, evolve, grow in the world. And so for me, I mean, this is the negative side that I'd say, and the things that I'm concerned about and worried about, because I think that the projects and the places that I'm most excited about, and when I say places, it's not necessarily projects. It can be archaeological sites. It can be natural and native spaces and national parks, in the world. But the places that I find most engaging and most eye-opening and really transformative for myself over time have been places that have taken a long time to become what they are. And whether that's geologic time and ecological time, or it's design time, design focus, and construction, these places that are allowed to develop through the orders that drive them physically are the
Mhm.
places that I feel most meaningful. And I think that kind of time is not always allowed when you're trying to get things out of AI and when you're thinking of delivering ideas or design that have been driven mainly by AI. So that's not to say we don't and aren't open and aren't in some ways using some aspects of AI and in some things that we do, but it's being cautious about how that comes together and how we don't slide down the long slide of AI related to just ease of production.
Yeah, and I'm glad you expressed it that way, because I definitely also, as a practitioner, feel that pressure of time, and everyone needs everything yesterday. Like, the expectation is to push things forward, but you're doing it for the sake of a project that, we give trees time to grow. We give all these other things have time, but why do we as designers not?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like AI in some ways is helping accelerate us to solve some portion of those problems, more administrative, organizational, but in other ways, it's almost us giving in to like, oh yeah, we can do a quick turnaround, even though inevitably any process will take time. And I'm curious for you, are there other like other just like professional challenges that you've been faced with in recent times?
Well, there are many, many.
Yeah, it's constant.
Yeah, no, it's a hard one to pull out of the hat. I think professional challenges. I think one thing we've been thinking about, for years is, on the one hand, the idea of BIM and the sharing and real-time collaboration that's been becoming and has been possible, in different ways through computers and through sharing, whether it's sharing a model or sharing drawings and overlays. Like, that's great, and we are very connected to collaborators and other consultants through many parts of our process. At the same time, what also has happened is the ease of access to information means that a lot of people can think they can quickly find out and understand the bottom line issues, and whether it's the costs or it's the technical reasons or feasibility of something, it becomes hard when, if you're dealing with a broad team, you know, and a large client team, if everyone's doing their own quick research and they each get a quick little different or the same angle on some question that's coming up, there's often a lot of people that want to bring up this question and have a study done to address, their angle on this, or a way that might be more efficient or better. And I think that can be understandable if we can get to something that's more efficient or better. But oftentimes there are just glitches, in different ways of finding things out. And a designer does need to be able to pull different sources and ideas and potentials together and then make a recommendation. And I think that process of recommendation to get to design can be caught up in this process of simultaneous effort and investigation that can happen. That's a long answer, and I'm not sure if that was clear. But I think things don't happen in an insulated and linear way of design, and in many ways that's good. But in some ways, it can also mean that you don't have the time or have the focus available unless you really try hard to make that focus possible for your team on the inside.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex thing, especially when you are working on top of each other simultaneously. Oftentimes on multiple projects with overlapping deadline. Like it's just such a dynamic process at the end of the day. But I think it's also the opportunity, right? Like when you're aware of that as a challenge, your team can work together or collaborate in ways that help you find ways moving forward on a project.
Exactly. And I think that's what we've tried, and I think that's probably what all of the active and successful and some unsuccessful designers have been trying to do, through these last years, last decades, is trying to find ways to keep some of the things that were important and make the work and make the process and make the result, what you've been invested in and why we've signed on as part of this collective group that we are here. But then also knowing that there are new opportunities related to the new technology and what becomes more established technology, both in our field, but also across fields, because there is so much collaboration now. So then how can we work in different ways that might allow for a better result than sticking to some of the old ways that we thought were the way, or that people told us was the way? You know, Actually, that's not the way anymore because so much has changed. And so I guess trying to get to one, I think, great possibility is that we've been working on across projects is how can the sharing of information, the sharing of a single model, and the co-development across disciplines during a design process mean that we might be able to then document something that's very clearly documented so it can be bid out and then a contractor can be selected. But inside of that design, how can there then be bid opportunities for later customization or abilities and ways to deal with specifics on a site or specifics in a community that are able to be realized, in the construction process or in the management process after construction, that would not necessarily be documented in the same hardlined way that they had been documented in the past, because in a certain way, maybe there were limitations to doing an exact design that then gets built exactly as the drawing said, because by the time that happens, some things about the environment or the world or the site might be different in the kinds of places that we work in. And so how can we then take in those new realities of the moment when we work on things that might be designed and bid 10 years or 5 years before the landscape construction happens? And so that's something we've been trying to make allowances for and find ways of getting into documentation that we're doing.
Yeah, that's such a great opportunistic perspective on BIM modeling, because what's interesting is you've been talking about time scale this whole time, and that's a whole different horizon of time scale. Is how do you account for that in the technical portions of your process that allow these projects to still be built, because that's the goal, but be flexible, have flexible enough parameters throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And yeah, just love your insights. The way you think about design and speak about it so clearly is just lovely to hear. I'm also curious, just, what advice would you have for other designers, people in the profession, or a younger version of yourself?
I mean, I think that for me, what I really want young designers to know is that I think it's the things that the overlap between people, between cultures, between the, facts of the world that connect all of us, the living systems, but that there's so much variety and so much difference, in the world. And as a landscape architect, I think you're working between all of that. How can I make things as accessible and open and engaging to as many as possible? But how can it be specific, what we're doing? And I think into that, each designer's specific abilities, talents, insight is what really offers the opportunity. And so I think that I would say individual designers shouldn't lose themselves to thinking about this as a profession, as a system, as something that you're, engaging and jumping onto, but instead also look at what it is inside that is important in the world and in practice, and what is it that you want to sort of bring to it, and what connections can you make, between your work and the people and systems, animals and plants around us. I think that the individual person has a lot of value in the design world, but I think it's, from a landscape architecture standpoint, it's really about the back and forth between the individual and the broad collective that's inside of landscape.
Yeah, I love that. Individual agency meets collective will and forward thinking. So yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Adam. I know you're in high demand over there getting the world built, but how can our designers and builders community best connect with you?
Anyway, I mean, designers and builders can reach out. We have a info at PWP link on our website. That would be the initial way. And then we're ready to meet, talk. Both I am, but also I have partners, associates, and colleagues here. All of us love to have people over or love to go visit places with others. If anyone's interested in doing that, let us know.
Okay, sounds good. Well, one taker for sure. So I'll be circling back on that.
Sounds good. We'd love to have you over. Come on.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.